Hi, and welcome to this session that we're having today with Mark Beelan from Avow Hospice. He's here with us today to discuss a wonderful life directive entitled 5 Wishes. Now we have samples of this that's going to be on our website, so you could pull this up and you could be looking at that while we go through this. If you also want to have a real copy of it, if you will, one that's not a sample, we are going to have copies of this available in the office. Both of us want to recommend to you that this is something you very seriously consider doing now when you don't need it. So you have an opportunity to look at it, give it some serious consideration and thought. We know it's not an easy topic. However, when you need it, that's not the time to try and figure it out. So with that in mind, I want to get started and I want to introduce Mark Beelan and have him tell you a little bit about himself and what he does at Avow.
Yes, almost 5 years ago, I began working as a community liaison at Avow. And my position was to create awareness in the community, initially about our services, which is hospice and palliative care, and grief support and caregiver support. But soon after I had started, they asked me to give presentations on advanced directives as well. And I said, fine. I said, but what's that? I wasn't aware of what that was. And I spoke with somebody that had been doing it at Avow that explained that this is a way to let your family and loved ones and others know what your wishes would be if there was a decision whether or not you needed life support and who would make those decisions, if you would prefer life support or not, and also who would be in charge of making those decisions. And I thought immediately of Terri Schiavo. I don't know if you remember that case, but it was about 25 years ago or so, a young lady in Tampa in her 20s. Was in her hallway, passed out, and she was there very long before somebody found her. She was there for hours. And when she got to the hospital, they were able to resuscitate her, but she was never able to come out of the coma she was in from the brain damage. Yes. And her husband, after 2.5 years, had, and a lot of therapy and no response, felt as though she wouldn't want to remain on life support. Her parents disagreed. And they did not have advanced directives, which was obviously the problem, because this would not have been an issue if there had been advanced directives. And there were no laws at that time. Therefore, this went on in the courts for about 15 years. And after 15 years, her life support was removed. Now, I am not here to criticize whether somebody would want life support or not. What I am here is to criticize those of us who have not had those conversations and put something in writing saying this is what I would want if I could not communicate. So that's what I want you to do. And again, I'm not here to advocate for life support or against life support. I respect anybody's personal decision.
Right. It is that, a personal decision. So let's start our questions out with this first one. What is the difference between an advanced directive and a do not resuscitate order?
Yes, those are two very different documents. For example, the do not resuscitate order, which needs to be on yellow paper, is for somebody who has made a decision that if they were to stop breathing, if their heart were to stop, not to be resuscitated, not to call 911 and have emergency come and try to resuscitate you. Why somebody would do that? A hospice patient is a great example. Most of our patients, 99% of our patients, are terminally ill and know they're going to pass away. And if they know they're going to stop breathing soon, and if they were to stop breathing and someone were to call 911, there would probably be a lot of damage to their ribs, and they would break and puncture their lungs, and they would be in worse shape physically than they would be. And in most cases, they wouldn't be able to save their life, but if they did, that would not be a positive outcome in most cases. Most people agree at that point to have a do not resuscitate order, which does need to be signed by a physician and be on yellow paper, and most people put this on the refrigerator. This isn't for everyone, obviously, but this is for a certain group of people where that makes sense. Now, advanced directives is what we were talking about, and it's for anybody 18 years or older. And why that's important is somebody who's 18 could be driving in a car, get hit by a truck, end up in a permanent coma. And in that case, the parents, assuming they had not done an advanced directives, which we know most 18-year-olds and younger people don't, even older people, many of them don't. So what you want to do is, even if you have those conversations, or if the parents have a game plan of something like that were to happen. I actually asked my son shortly before he turned 18, And I asked him what his feelings were about if that were to happen. And again, these aren't conversations we like to have. I don't like to imagine my son getting hit by a truck and being permanently in a coma, but I wanted to know what his thoughts and feelings were. And he said, well, maybe for 2 weeks, I wouldn't mind being left on life support, but if they felt that there was no opportunity to get better, then I wouldn't want to remain on that. He said, could I do that? Well, with the 5 wishes, you can. It's more difficult. There's a standard form you can get online. It's not the advance directive, but it's not the do not resuscitate order. It's an advance directive, but it's just one page that has your healthcare surrogate information and the other page that has your life support information. And there you have a choice of yes or no. I want life support or I don't want life support. But on the 5 wishes document, and I'll go over that, there is a section where you have a yes, no, and what I call the maybe. The maybe is, I would like to be on life support unless at some point they feel that I will not improve, my condition will not improve. Then I would like to be taken off of life support.
So it gives you options, more options.
Yes, you do have more options with this document. And you could even customize that. And you could write in saying, after a week, I would want to be taken off. After a month, after a year, after a decade, whatever it is you want, you could specify. And the good thing about that is your loved ones and family and anybody involved with your life knows what you would want, and it takes away all the conflict, it takes away all the stress of people having to make those decisions. Yes. So that's the difference, by the way, and I'm sorry. And let me just to make it very clear, so advanced directives is for anybody 18 years older. You can be extremely healthy and you still want to do an advanced directive. Do not resuscitate is for somebody who's gotten to a point where if they did stop breathing, they would not want to be resuscitated. I have one of these. I don't have one of these. So Sherry, if I were to fall and stop breathing, please call 911.
We will do just that.
And then that's where this will come in.
Exactly.
Once I'm taken to the hospital, if they need to decide whether I'm not on life support, that's where this document comes in. I just wanted to specify that.
Specify the two. So our next question is, should I use the 5 wishes document even if it is not one of the 42 states that are listed as having approved the document? Because there is a listing of states in there.
Yes, when you open the document on the first page to the right, page 3, there's a list of states that show where this document is legal, including Florida if you happen to live in Florida. If you happen to live in another state, or if you live in 2 states, then you need to make sure you're using that other document of that other state. And this way here you have both areas covered. It's still better to have something than nothing. So I'm not an attorney, and if you want legal advice, you really need to speak to an attorney. But I do know that at least even if you had it in one state and not the other, if they had something to refer to, that is so much better than having nothing. And again, it's the conversations too that are important, that people know what your wishes are.
So why do you prefer, you and I have been talking, and why do you prefer starting with wish number 2 instead of wish number 1? Wish number 2 is my wish for the kind of medical treatment I want or don't want.
Yes, and wish number 1 is who do you want as your healthcare. I call healthcare surrogate because in Florida they're called healthcare surrogates. In this document, this document is meant for several states, and it's called the healthcare agent, I believe. But there's a reason for that. Before we decide who we want to have those decisions, I'm not criticizing the document. There's been millions and millions of these used, and it's a great document. But it's just a personal pet peeve that before we want to decide who's going to make the decision, I want to make sure you understand what that decision is. So I always like to skip to that second wish and then go back to the first wish, which is the reason. So let me go to wish number 2, which is the kind of medical treatment you would want or not want if you could not communicate and there had to be a decision whether or not you required life support. And I'm just going to read what life support entails. Life support could be a medical procedure, a device, a medication. It could be medical devices to help you breathe, to have food, water. It could be tube feeding. It could be CPR, major surgery, blood transfusions, dialysis, and antibiotics. That covers a wide range of life support. Now, there's some cases, especially with some faiths, where there may be what do I want to call it? A rule they have that somebody always has to have some type of hydration.
Right. Okay.
And you can actually customize this. You can write in the lines. If you did not want life support, for example, you might say, I would not want any of these methods of life support except for the water being supplied and hydration and that type
So you
of
can
thing.
specify.
So
what
you
your-
can say that, and you could even write, what your faith is, and or even if it's not tied to a religion, if there's something you want to customize,
Right,
you can write that in there.
personal preference, right.
If you do not put anything here, they will assume that if you do not want life support, they will not do any of this, and if you want life support, they will do all of the above. So
Right.
it's just important to understand that part of what life support means.
Mhm.
When you turn the page 7 in the document, there are several areas where you can choose. You want to have life support, you do not want life support, and if it has been started, it could be stopped. Again, some people think for some reason, or they've told me that they have been told that once it starts, you can't remove it.
Yeah.
Legally, that's not true. And that's why you want a healthcare surrogate, that if your wish was not to have life support and somebody was in a hospital and they told you they couldn't remove it, you want somebody that will make sure that
Stand
your
up for you,
wishes
absolutely.
are met and that they'll yell, scream, call the news, call the,
Right.
whatever it takes.
Make
That's
sure
the
it
kind of
happens.
person you want.
Yeah.
Yes, you don't want somebody shy who's going to come and say, okay, well, if you say it can't be done.
Right.
So that's why it's important to understand what's involved with these decisions when you can't communicate. Now, there's several areas here. There's close to death. That's somebody in general that knows they're going to be passing away soon, and they could choose whether they want to have life support, not want life support. And again, that third one was, I want to have life support treatment if my doctor believes it can help, but I want my doctor to stop giving me life support treatment if it is not helping my health condition or symptoms. That's one I call the maybe one, and that gives the family flexibility to see what the
Conditions
situation
are,
is,
sure.
yes. And then make a decision knowing that the person was open to life support if they felt that their condition could be improved, but not to if they felt the person would remain unconscious and not be able to
Right.
communicate forever. So one area is close to death. You have those same options for somebody in a coma and not expected to wake up or recover. You also have permanent and severe brain damage and not expected to recover. That's what happened with Terry Schiavo when
Right.
her oxygen wasn't going to the brain. And then you have another section where it says, in another condition under which I do not want to be kept alive. So one of those, there's a whole
Yeah, what
bunch
would that
of
be?
neurological
Oh, okay.
diseases. There's ALS, Parkinson's, dementia. There's all these other types of conditions that you may want to be specific as far as, and unfortunately there's a large percentage of people in our community that suffer with those diseases. And that's another area where you want to be specific if you would want life support or not want life support. And again, you can customize this however you like. You can write that information right in here
Okay.
and specify those wishes.
So that would be another situation where someone would add to this list, right? Because that was one of the
Yes.
questions I was gonna ask you, so that might be another thing they would just add into here.
And it could be other types of conditions too. I just use that as an example because those are
Right.
very common, unfortunately, in
yeah. Yes.
our community and throughout the world, actually.
So then going back to our wish number one, the person I want to make healthcare decisions for me, is the person closest to someone the best person to serve as their healthcare surrogate?
It's a great question, and it's not a yes or no answer. It really depends on the person. And I had a learning experience recently, unfortunately, but I did learn quite a bit about the person who's number one on my list as far as my healthcare surrogate. Now, some people automatically assume it's your spouse if you're married. The trouble with that is if, for example, somebody did not want life support and the spouse wasn't comfortable removing the life support,
Right.
emotions could get in the way, and that could create issues. And that is why very often they say don't pick the person closest to you, pick somebody a little bit more objective that wouldn't have a problem meeting your wishes even though they may not be 100% comfortable
Right.
with it. For example, I have a brother-in-law, Jack, my sister's husband, and he is the perfect healthcare surrogate. He's a rough, tough guy, and no matter what's going on, he would say, these are his wishes, and this is what we're going to
Yeah,
do, and he would
that's
not
what you
take no
need.
for an answer.
Right.
So technically, he would be my number one choice. Now, I'm going to say something that my initial supervisor at Eval, and I don't know about the leadership at Eval, doesn't really like me to say, because I'm telling you it's technically true that it may not be the person closest to you. However, and this is what I ended up doing, I do believe that our relationships are important. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. So I had a choice. I didn't know. I asked my wife. We discussed the document when I did the document for myself. And I said, if I did not want life support, how comfortable would you feel about following my wishes? And she said, okay, fine, yeah, put me down, that's fine. And I wasn't really sure I had the right person. But I put her down as number one because I love my wife and I want to make sure that I don't hurt her feelings. I didn't want to come up and say, hey, I picked Jack as my first choice. You're actually not even on here because I really don't trust you to meet my wishes. We have our son and then my brother.
You're very careful.
So yes, so I do believe that is a factor when choosing this.
Right.
You want to have
Yes.
politically sensitive discussions when you do this, and you have more than one child, then
Yes, that's right.
Yes, so those are the types of things I would say to consider when having those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the good news. I knew when I picked my wife as number one and my brother-in-law as number two that he had a copy of this. You want to make sure all the healthcare surrogates have this. You want to make sure this goes to your physician's office. It's scanned in your medical records.
Oh.
You want to make sure your pastor. You want to make sure as many people have this as they can. So if everybody knew, for example, in my case, if I did not want life support and something happened and my wife said, no, leave my life support, I have my brother-in-law and a bunch of other people and something in the medical records that show that is not what I wanted. And that could eventually, if she didn't change her mind, there's enough people that I know that would support and have it go to mediation, and then the decision would have to be made.
It would still be hard, but yes.
So yeah, and I heard in those cases sometimes people will come around in the initial shock, especially if it's a sudden tragedy. That's why you never know what's going to happen, and that's why it's important, no matter how healthy you are, to have these conversations.
Please have one, yes.
But that I knew I was backed up. Now, the unfortunate experience we had was with my mother-in-law, my wife's mom. And she was unfortunately, at the beginning of January, not long ago of this year, she was diagnosed with something called CJD. And a few weeks before that, she was actually completely normal. She was in her early 70s, which for us is considered not really that old. Yeah. And she's relatively young. And she was healthy. And very quickly, she started to become unresponsive. She was on her phone all day long when she was healthy, texting and calling, and she went from that to not being able to use her phone. She would just stare at her phone. We knew something was wrong. They eventually took her to NCH, and after a week and a half, they could not come up with her diagnosis. They couldn't figure out what was wrong. They did all these tests. They tried several treatments to see if something was effective. In the meantime, nothing was effective. So they ended up recommending we take her up to Tampa General, and that's within 2 days she was diagnosed with CJD, and that was January 11th. So at that point, she had a prognosis of only a day to a week to live. So decisions had to be made, and one decision was whether or not to be on hospice. Now, the neurologist highly recommended it because, and I was the contact person. He didn't know I worked for a hospice organization, but I was listening to what he had to say, and I agreed because he said that she could be in severe pain, but she couldn't communicate. Right. So I immediately spoke to my wife and her family, and they agreed to have her moved from Tampa General to Naples, where all her family is, as soon as possible. It happened within a day. They were able to get her to her inpatient unit. But then there were other decisions that needed to be made too. And by the way, in that process, her family told myths that I covered in a previous presentation about morphine ending people's life, which isn't true. She actually spent 11 days in hospice, even though the prognosis was a day to a week. But I really explained, when you slow down the heart with morphine, it's to help breathe, but it's not enough to end somebody's life actually, and we were able to make her comfortable. Another was IV, part of the life support of the fluids. Well, they said that they were not going to give her IV, and that was a learning experience for me. I knew that when somebody's in the process of passing away, they can't process foods, they can't eat and drink, and if you try to force that, when they're in a coma, when their body,
that's a different thing.
Not a Terry Schiavo case, but in the case of somebody who's actively passing away, they can't process foods, and if you try to force that, it can actually create a lot of pressure in the body and a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. So if you put fluids like IV in there, it could go into their lungs, it doesn't leave the body, it swells up. So, we had to, and the reason I mention that is part of the advanced directives is to have the discussion if somebody would want hospice or not, if they could make that decision for themselves. But what I found in this case, my mother-in-law did not want to speak about any of this, whether she wanted hospice or whether she would want life support or whether she'd want to be buried or cremated, and those decisions had to be dealt with. Now, because she didn't have advanced directives, Florida now, after the Terry Schiavo case, has a default where if they have a spouse, then the spouse is the one to make the decisions. And I believe it's adult children, siblings, parents, etc. There's a whole list that they go to in order for people to be assigned to make those decisions if they don't have
Right.
advance directives. In this case, it was my mother-in-law's husband who was distraught. He was catatonic. He couldn't deal with anything. He couldn't make decisions. So luckily, we made the decisions for him. What I found in this particular case, the person I thought would have been the best in her family is her brother, because he's kind of like my brother-in-law. He's a tough, rough kind of, he's not going to take no for an answer. He was also distraught. He was very close to my mother-in-law, and he basically went into shock, and we were kind of worried about him too. We actually had an ambulance pick him up because he was greatly affected. Whereas my wife was completely in control, and everything that happened before and after she had passed away was all about this is what she would want, and this is what we want to make sure we want to do, and she stayed very much in control. So that was a learning experience for me. I
so you had that first-hand experience with why this is so important.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we don't have those experiences many times, and we have to make a decision. The important thing is just to try to guess who that person would be, and at least you have that hierarchy, whether it's the person closest to you or not. But the other thing to remember is you are free. There's 3 options here. You have a number 1, 2, and 3. And when you put first will be that first person they go to. If
and
they're
make
not
sure
available,
you discuss it with them.
Oh, absolutely.
Make sure they know it.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right, so moving on to wish number 3, which is my wish for how comfortable I want to be. So a question I have for you to get us started, there is a reference to knowing one's options for hospice care included in this section. And the question is, why is this important?
And that's exactly what I was speaking about earlier. It's hard to determine whether you would not want hospice or not if you were to, have to make that decision down the road, but you didn't understand what that was.
Right.
It's also hard to make that decision up front when you're doing advanced directives if you
Yes.
don't understand. So all of these areas are good to look at and make a decision whether or not this is something that you would.
Yeah, and they're very well written. There's a lot of different choices here, a lot of things for you to look at that you probably never even thought of, and it would take you a little while to maybe get through this because you have to really give these some thought.
Yes, and one thing I want to mention is if there's something that you disagree with, there's several lines
Yes.
under which 3 you can cross it
So
out.
you just cross them
If
out.
for some reason you don't want that. I'm going to use my wife again for an example with this, because she did start working on this and she started to fill it out. And I knew that she didn't like massages because when we had our first year anniversary, I bought her for a spa,
She
an
said,
hour
"No, thank
massage,
you."
and she gave it to me. She goes, I don't want anybody massaging me. So I was curious after she filled it out. I looked at Wish 3, which is on page 8, and I was curious to see, number 1, if she was really reading this, and number 2, what her reaction would be. And she took a big black magic marker and just completely crossed it out. I recommend not doing that, because what you want to do is cross it out and still be able to read it, so somebody knows you don't want this.
Yeah,
So
you
if
don't
she
want it
happens to
totally
be,
redacted so you don't see it.
so if somebody happens to be at a place like our hospice house and they do have massage therapy, it's at least the person knows not to do that.
Right. Good point. Very good point. So, all right, moving on, wish number 4, my wish for how I want people to treat me. This wish includes having members of one's faith-based organization contacted if they become sick and asked to pray for me. How can I assure that this is accomplished?
Yes, it's good to communicate your wish again, one way or the other. For example, if you want the members of your church and pastor to pray for you, then it's good to make sure that's known. And you can write that in here. Even though it's here, you might want to highlight and say, please do this. However, we know, because we have chaplains that work with patients, that sometimes it's a private matter. And sometimes they prefer not to. They don't want to get phone calls, because if you announce that to the church, they may have a lot of people calling saying, hey, I'm sorry to hear about Bill and this and that. So if you don't want that, that's also important to make that clear.
And make sure your pastor knows that.
Yes. So please communicate with your pastor and
Exactly.
as far as those types of wishes as well.
So wish number 5, my wish for what I want my loved ones to know. This includes information as to funeral arrangements. What if one has, and I guess that's the question, what if one has not yet made this decision? Because there's quite a few things that go into funeral arrangements. So what about that?
That's another reason why I highly prefer the 5 wishes over a standard 2-page document, because it does include a very important part where it says, after my death I would like my body to be, it says circle 1, buried or cremated.
Yes.
Many people do not have these conversations. And again, that happened with my mother-in-law. It also, I had given a presentation on the 5 wishes to a Toastmasters group. And after the presentation, one of my friends in Toastmasters who's been married to his wife at that time, he had been married 35 years now, it's a few years later. But he said, you know, I don't think Robin knows whether I want to be buried or cremated or not, all 35 years of marriage. I said, really? Now, we're in a parking lot, and she was quite a few feet, much further than you are, Sherry, down and speaking to some other people. And he said, well, let's find out. And he goes, Robin! And she goes, yeah! He goes, do I want to be buried or cremated? And she said, buried? And he said, no, cremated! And he said, there you go. Now she knows.
Now she knows.
And it always gets, you know, I say that, it gets a laugh. But, you know, at least the honest truth is they know now. And those conversations are not had. So if this gets people to have those conversations.
And while
it's
you're
well
doing
worth
it and you don't particularly are in a crisis situation, it's a lot easier to joke about it and make it easier to give the answers to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's also things in here about your memorial service that you can be talking to your pastor about. If there's songs you want, if there's a place that you want to be, there's a lot of things that can be written down and included in this particular section. So
yes, you can get specific as possible.
Yes. So for the last 2 questions I have, the last one is, who should receive copies of the 5 wishes? So you've done all this work, you've made all these, you know, inputs into this document, then what happens to it?
Yes, and I did jump on that earlier where you do want to make sure that all your healthcare surrogates have this, and anyone else in the family I would recommend. For example, if it's 2 children out of 4 that are surrogates, but the other 2 aren't, you still might want to make sure they have copies so they're aware of your wishes. And all your family members, pastor, physician, and very important to ask your physician to scan this into your medical records.
Yes, and they'll do that. They're very happy to do that, I know. So what happens if the current 5 wishes document needs to be revised? So is it something that's not just lays here, you might need to keep looking at it over a period of time, maybe.
Yes, I heard one person saying it might sound, you know, quite a bit, but it's probably not a bad idea just to get in the habit. Somebody said when you do your taxes, take a look at your advance directives. So at least automatically you're looking at it every year. So yes, this is something, and this is the reason why the first presentation I gave almost 5 years ago, I asked who has advance directives, and it was at Morgan's Park, and everybody raised their hands. And I thought, oh, why am I here if they have advance directives? Well, I got done talking about the 5 wishes, and every single one came up, and they didn't only want 1 copy. Some have asked for 3 or 4 copies. So this is the type of thing that's fluid. It's not something you do once and just forget about. It's something you want to maintain.
There's a lot of different things in here to discuss and to go through. It's really a very full document. So we want to thank you very much, Mark, for coming today and talking about this. I want to encourage all of you here at the church, if you've watched this, to go through it, look at the sample that we're going to have on the website. And if you would like to have one of these, please come into the office. Don will have it. And if you have any other questions, you can always give Mark a call to Val. Thank you again for coming, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Bye now.